Hello. At this point in our totalitarian states unit, we've looked at the far left of the political spectrum, communism, under Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union. We're going to shift 180 degrees, so to speak, now and move to the far right, and we're going to look at fascism. And we're going to start with the man who created modern fascism, Benito Mussolini, known often by his people as the Duke or Duce, which simply means the Duke or the boss. In a lot of ways, Mussolini served as the model for Hitler. World War II historians tend to look at Mussolini as the lesser partner, but as you'll find out, Hitler modeled a lot of what he did off of what Mussolini had done. Before we look at Mussolini himself, a little bit of background on Italy after the First World War. You may remember that Italy had been one of the big four allies as part of the negotiation team. However, Italy wasn't particularly satisfied with the Treaty of Versailles, despite being on the winning side. They thought their role against Austria in the war deserved a little bit more reward than they ended up getting. As you can see here, they didn't get all the territory they captured in the war, and that didn't sit well with them. Another problem with Italy is that it was a multi-party parliament. There wasn't just two parties, there were many, many different parties. And while that does create spirited debate, it often can lead to chaos and disorder, even today. The pictures you see here are from recent events within the Italian parliament, sometimes breaking down into violence right on the floor. The parliament might have been able to get through had it had a stronger leader at the head. However, King Victor Emmanuel, seen here in the lower right-hand corner, didn't have the personal authority or the personal charisma to be able to solve the problems. This is going to be where somebody like Benito Mussolini comes in and takes advantage of a situation. All right, Mussolini himself. He was born in 1883. His dad was actually a craftsman by trade, a blacksmith. It's interesting in that Dad was also a socialist activist. If you may remember, socialism is just to the right of communism, which puts it pretty far over to the left on the political scale. More on that in a couple of minutes. Mom happened to be a school teacher, so it's not like he came from poverty or a disadvantaged situation. Nonetheless, he wasn't a really happy kid by most accounts. He waged his first rebellion at the age of 8. Over the food at his school, of all things. Apparently tater tots didn't sit too well with him. He was thrown out of school at the age of 11 for stabbing another student with a penknife. Again, not a nice little kid. Sadly, he eventually graduated, and for a time he went to become a teacher. We have to stress here, not for long. We certainly don't count him among the Brotherhood. What he did get into was political agitation. In 1902, when he came of age for the draft, he decided to leave Italy so that he wouldn't be drafted and go into the military. He bounced around Europe for a little bit, but spent most of his time in Switzerland, where he was active in socialist party movements. As you can see from the upper left, he didn't always get along well with the authorities. Witness the mugshot and the fingerprinting here. Eventually, he found his way back to Italy, and by the age of 29 he was the publisher of Italy's biggest socialist newspaper, called Avanti. Here's your thought for right now. What do you suppose being a publisher and a publisher of a socialist newspaper is going to do for a man who will later become known as the father of modern fascism? You can think of it in a couple of ways. First of all, as a publisher, this means that Mussolini is going to be particularly good and acute at propaganda. In fact, after he becomes dictator of Italy, he'll have all the major daily papers brought to his office every day, and he would mark them up in red or blue pencil to indicate what he liked or didn't like about what the papers were saying. That's something that comes directly from his editing and publishing days. As to why it makes a difference if he's a socialist early on, you might look at it this way. When a football player gets cut from one team, often the next team to pick him up is a team in that same division. Why would one team want somebody from another team? Well, guess who knows the other team's playbook? Guess who knows their secrets? Mussolini's going to take his time as a socialist and use it to his advantage. When he becomes a fascist, he knows the socialist playbook. He knows their system, he knows their ideas, he knows their approaches, and therefore he's better able to counteract them. So this experience is going to be invaluable to him. The other great experience of his life happens when World War II happens. Remember, he dropped out of Italy in 1902 to avoid the draft. In 1915, he volunteers for the Italian army, and he fights in the Alps during World War I. That's him pushing the artillery piece in this picture, and he's at the center with the mustache in this picture. During this time, he's hit by shrapnel, something that he refers to as the most magnificent experience of his life. Now, whether this creates an emotional rush for him or what, we don't know exactly. We do know that he enters the war pretty much a socialist, and he leaves the war pretty much ready to move over to the right side of the scale and become eventually the leader of the fascist movement. So there's a major change in his politics. After World War I, Mussolini formed the Fascist Party. You may remember from previous discussion that the fascist symbol is called the fascia. It's an axe attached to a batch of rods, the axe representing power, the rods representing unity. It's an ancient Roman symbol, and this bit of history is important. Mussolini decides to let Italy believe that he's going to bring back the glory days of the Roman Empire, and he invokes this Roman history in most of his speeches and much of his propaganda. Every leader needs followers. In Mussolini's case, he picked up a lot of disgruntled army veterans who used their old uniforms to create a new uniform, known as the black shirts. Because they were veterans, they knew 1, how to fight, 2, how to march, and 3, how to take orders. All of these elements meant that the black shirts would be able to intimidate Mussolini's opposition. At local elections, anybody who opposed the Fascist Party might be threatened out of voting or out of running for office. And although Mussolini's goon squad was ready to break heads or legs if needed, they weren't really as big a deal as they appeared to be. But because they were organized and because they were aggressive, they made a much bigger noise and therefore were more intimidating than they really should have been. This comes into play in 1922 when Mussolini makes his big final assault on the Italian government. The black shirts in these pictures here in full uniform marched through various Italian cities, culminating in a march on Rome, the capital itself. Along with these marches, there were lots of clashes between socialists, communists, and fascists on the streets of the cities. Mussolini steps up and promises to stop the violence if certain conditions are met. 1. The king had to name Mussolini prime minister, which meant that Mussolini would more or less direct the policies of the parliament. As you can see, Mussolini ended up getting what he wanted. You can see here that he had a perpetual scowl on his face, lots of bravado in his approach. In poker terms, Mussolini used the March on Rome to basically go all in. He was betting on the fact that the government wouldn't try to stop him and the black shirts in any way, that they'd be intimidated by him. It's kind of like going into a poker game and risking all of your winnings on nothing more than a pair of twos, and hope the other side folds. In Mussolini's case, his bluff won out. The other side gave in, and he became prime minister. Doesn't mean he's going to have absolute power yet, however. There was still a very active socialist and communist movement within the Italian parliament. This gentleman here in the picture is Giacomo Matteotti. He was the leader of the Italian socialist movement, and one of the few people brave enough to speak out against Mussolini. For his trouble, Matteotti ended up being kidnapped, shot to death, and his body dumped by the side of the road. The actual shooters and kidnappers were never found and never discovered. Mussolini's response was pretty simple. Essentially, his response took 3 points. 1, I didn't do it. 2, but I feel badly about it. And 3, you better make me dictator before it happens again. If you check out this cartoon on the left here, you may notice that the cartoonist has a particular idea about who's behind Matteotti's death. Note the use of the symbols here. Mussolini, and a coffin that just happens to have Matteotti's name on it. You can probably figure it out from here. Mussolini created something called the corporate state. This is what he's best known for, perhaps, and we'll be getting into that in part 2 of this screencast. See you then.